Penn State versus Georgia Tech in Madison Square Garden, Saturday, November 16th, noon tip-off. I mean, this one is exciting because it's in New York City, right? You get the chance to play where the Knicks play, and Penn State has a little bit of a momentum here. It seemed like, wow, let's sell out on this team. And I think basketball, unlike football, right? You lose 5 games in a row, Adam, in football, especially at college, like your season's over, right? Especially if you had lofty expectations. In the NFL, because of the 17th game, maybe you can overcome it, right? And you can finish 9-8 seems to get you in the playoffs nowadays. But besides the point, but in basketball's a long season. Like Penn State last year, you can afford a losing streak. And as we saw how late it was down the stretch too, they were able to afford that, right the ship, circle the wagons, and get into the NCAA tournament. Penn State, I feel like, is exercising some of these demons early on. Get the 5-game losing streak out of your system now. Lose to Bucknell now. Do not lose to those kinds of teams late in the season, because then the committee will really hold it against you. They want to see improvement. Georgia Tech is a good test for Penn State because they've beaten Mississippi State. They've beaten Duke, but they are 5-3. Right? They are 5-3. This team flows through Miles Kelly, guard on this team, averaging 17 points per game, almost 6.5 rebounds. So you're getting you're basically getting talent on talent, right? Strength on strength. Kanye, Clary, and Ace Baldwin, backcourt heavy types of teams, and star players at the position here. But this is like Penn State. I would say it's a deep team. You have guys that, they'll go about 7-8 deep at talent across the board. They rebound very well, right? They're averaging 41 rebounds per game, but it's not that in comparison. Maybe they're a little lower down the rankings compared to some other powerhouses, but not Penn State, who's averaging 32.
Yep.
So the matchup that I see is trying to limit, because you're not going to stop them. Try to limit a Miles Kelly. You have more versions of Miles Kelly on your team. You have Kanye Clary and you have Ace Baldwin. They only have one Miles Kelly. So I feel like Penn State, if they can continue to improve on the zone, but also at the same time, again, they're trying to mix and match. What worked against Ohio State is not going to work against an ACC team like Georgia Tech necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big question. Miles Kelly versus Ace Baldwin Jr. is going to be the matchup in this game that everyone's going to watch. Miles Kelly, you mentioned, averaging 17 points per game. Then another interesting matchup is going to be Kanye Clary versus Kawasi Reeves Jr., another one of their good guards that they have. But I think the one thing Penn State has to look at, and the number that really stands out to me, is Georgia Tech only averages 13 assists per game. No guy out there. They're not really kicking out a lot to three-point shooters. It's a lot of one-on-one, which is similar to Penn State in the way they play, with Kanye Clary and Ace Baldwin Jr. trying to get to the rim and looking to score first. So I think that's going to be the interesting matchup. Penn State, if they do want to play one-on-one, if they're going to help and force them to kick out the shooters, that's going to be interesting. In Penn State, they've had a whole week to think about it. They've had finals week off, so they don't play again until Saturday when they play Georgia Tech. So they've had a whole week to really focus on this matchup against Georgia Tech, fix some of the stuff they saw against Ohio State, so they don't give themselves an 18-point deficit in this game and try to have to claw their way back. Right? That's going to be the interesting thing. How can Ace Baldwin Jr., who we mentioned A10 Defensive Player of the Year, has struggled at times defensively, handle Miles Kelly in this game? Because that's who's going to guard him, I'm assuming. They'll probably throw Nick Kern Jr. on him as well a little bit, put some more size and athleticism on him, try to mix it up, try to throw a lot of different looks and see. I just kind of try to bother him and make someone else beat you on that Georgia Tech team. Don't allow Miles Kelly to go get 30 and be able to win this game for Georgia Tech. Force other guys to get involved, and don't allow Miles Kelly to be the reason that they win in Madison Square Garden.
Well, when you look at this team, right, wins against Mississippi State and Duke are great. That's 21st and 7th, respectively, at the time. But then you just look at some of the team statistics, and it's almost, how did they do it? Because they shoot under 30% from three-point range. They're shooting under 40% from just in general from the field. And Georgia Tech, is it that they just play good overall defense? Because Penn State, the reason why they won that game against Ohio State, you said getting the stops and being able to manage the comeback. But Ohio State had a lot of turnovers compared to Penn State protecting the basketball. So even though Georgia Tech might clean up the glass a little better, they're okay. They're a little better at distributing the basketball than Penn State. But if Georgia Tech is not able to get its own turnovers, and Penn State can have about 4 or 5 again, then maybe I'm leaning towards the Nittany Lions in this case because Georgia Tech does not shoot well. Like you said, Penn State can't afford to get into shootouts. If they meet a good shooting team, they'll probably lose that game at least 9 times out of 10 this part of the season. Later down the road, that's a different conversation that we'll probably end up having. But in this case, I like this matchup. I am not scared of the fact that they beat Duke and Mississippi State. I think they caught them in bad spots. Like I said, I think you have strength on strength to essentially negate what Georgia Tech does. Georgia Tech runs this entire system through Miles Kelly offensively. Kawasi Reeves, I'm glad you brought him up. He's the second leading scorer with 12 points a game, and he shoots the 3 ball really well. But that's essentially it for Georgia Tech as far as star power. They don't collectively shoot well. So Penn State in this case, they have a favorable matchup in my opinion. I'm eager to see. I mean, we're doing this live, so we don't have the spread and the total in front of us, but I like Penn State to be able to win a close one because it's a neutral site game, but Penn State doesn't have to travel as far, right? Pennsylvania to New York City. This one was rumored to be in Atlanta at one point for the Hawks practice arena, and now they got to fly up to New York City. This is just it's not home advantage for Penn State, but it's certainly a little more favorable in terms of the environment.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be a favorable environment. Penn State has played well in Madison Square Garden. I haven't figured out why, but they always play well in Madison Square Garden. You mentioned the year they won the NIT and beat Utah. That same year is when the Big Ten tournament was in Madison Square Garden. They went all the way to the Final Four of the Big Ten tournament that year as well with Shep Garner, Tony Carr, Lamar Stevens, and that group. They've really played well in that building. So I think there's going to be a lot of momentum for them going into that game. They're feeling good coming off this big comeback win. They've had a week to prepare for it. So I think, a lot of things are lining up for Penn State to have a very good matchup. You mentioned it's favorable. Georgia Tech, a guard-oriented team. That's the way Penn State is as well. So they match up very well, very similar styles. And I think one thing you mentioned, they're not a great shooting team. Penn State's added this zone that they've really found against Ohio State that worked for them. So I think that's something they can add, as well as Georgia Tech doesn't have a dominant big. So you can get away with playing Leo Oboyo at the 5 and not sacrificing a lot on the interior, which is going to be huge for them as well. The key is going to be rebounding. We mentioned the high rebounding numbers for Georgia Tech. I'm assuming they're going to look at Penn State's numbers and say, we have to attack, get second chance opportunities. So Penn State's got to be able to make it one and done more times than not, get the possessions, and then be able to get shots. Turnover numbers are going to be huge in this game, trying to limit it down the way they did against Ohio State. That's how they came back. They forced turnovers and they protected the basketball. They got to continue to do that if they want to be successful this season and in this game. But it is a favorable matchup. I think a lot of people will look at Georgia Tech and say, well, they beat Duke, so Penn State really doesn't have a chance. That's not the case in this game. This Georgia Tech team, they did beat Duke, and you got to give them credit for that win, but it's a team that Penn State, it's not one of those where Penn State's looking on the other side like, man, we're cut out. It's going to be, we're fighting an uphill battle. They're very similar. It should be a really fun game to watch. And I actually agree with you. I do like Penn State in a very close game in this one to find a way to pull it out. It's going to be up to if that chemistry is really gelling. It's going to be a close game. Can Penn State execute in those last 4 minutes and find a way to get out of Madison Square Garden with another great win, which will be back-to-back Power 5 wins for Mike Rhoades.
Yeah, great for the resume too. Would this be a quad 1 win for them? You would know
I don't know
better
exactly where they're at.
It's right at the line. It's right on the line
there, but yeah, it's going to be really close. I think, however Penn State will look at it, they got to treat it as a quad 1 opportunity because every game's so important because you lost the game to Bucknell that you have to find a way to continue to build that resume. So all these games when you play these Power 5 teams are extremely important in boosting that resume. So quad 1, quad 2, it'll look good on the resume, and I think that's something. Penn State winning over the ACC and Georgia Tech, they beat Duke. They're 1-0 in the ACC. If they can make a run, I mean, that win could continue to look better and better depending how Georgia Tech does in the ACC this season.
Absolutely. I'll throw in 2 more keys before we get our official predictions here for this game. Georgia Tech, because they don't steal the ball very often, they don't force too many turnovers on average. They actually forced a lot of turnovers in those games against Mississippi State and Duke. But I think, Duke being a younger team, I know Kyle Filipowski came back. So you have some veterans, but they still recruit high school players and have them play very well. So you're getting a little bit of inexperience there. Penn State, what they've shown us is good at protecting the basketball. So that's one. And yes, rebounding is important. I agree with you. Georgia Tech does force missed shots. So where they make up for not being able to take the basketball away, they just force you to build houses and throw up a lot of bricks. So Penn State shooting, as you mentioned, being a key for this team to improving, is going to show up here against Georgia Tech. I know we've applauded Penn State's offense to this point. I'm actually going to go a little bit of a lower scoring type of game in this case. Penn State, I don't, in Georgia Tech, because Georgia Tech especially doesn't shoot well and they force more missed shots than more teams that Penn State's going to face routinely. I'm probably going to say this one's in the 60s. I would say Penn State 68, Georgia Tech 65 here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be low scoring. I don't think there's going to be a lot of points here. The one thing that you have to look at is it is an early tip-off. Penn State
That
is
too.
0-4 in those early tip-offs. They lost to A&M, they lost to Butler, and then they lost to VCU, and then, of course, the game to Bucknell when they played in those early slots. So I think it's going to be a slow start probably for both teams in Madison Square Garden. Also, the nerves are going to be up. You're playing in the world's most famous arena. You're going to be a little jacked up to get in the game, and maybe those shots are going long early. I think Penn State's going to find a way to win it. I think around 68-63. I think I'm kind of right there with you there.
Yeah.
I think Georgia Tech's going to try to slow the game down. I do not think with Penn State's guards and their ability to run, and that's how they've really generated offense, I don't think they're going to want to make this a track meet running up and down the floor with that pressure defense. So I think they're going to try to slow the game down, take shots, and then force Penn State to play in the half court, something at times they've struggled with, just if they're able to pack it in, make them kick it out, and make Penn State make shots. But I do think Penn State, it's a favorable matchup. It's a huge game. I think the team will understand the importance of this game going into it, and I think they will find a way to get a win over Georgia Tech.